So, welcome back, everybody. We are now having first an input by Kaushik Sunder Rajan, and then afterwards he will engage in a discussion with Emilia Sanabria. So I give you just a quick introduction of the two of them, and then we proceed. So Emilia Sanabria holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge, and since 2018, she's part of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. Her latest book, Plastic Bodies, Sex Hormones and Menstrual Suppression in Brazil, provides an ethnography of hormonal contraceptives in Brazil and offers an analysis of pharmaceuticals as objects of knowledge and circulation. And currently, Emilia is the principal investigator of a research project called Healing Encounters, which studies the striking expansion and prolific reinventions of healing practices that make use of the hallucinogenic Amazonian herbal brew ayahuasca. And maybe some of you, or maybe most of you, have seen her talk on ayahuasca yesterday. Kaushik Sunder Rajan is professor of anthropology and deputy director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. His current research covers the global interdependencies and changes in the biotech and pharmaceutical industries, which he describes by the term biocapital, and hopefully, of course, we hear more of this in a second. And his latest book, called Pharmacracy, Value, Politics and Knowledge in Global Biomedicine, was published in 2017 and focuses on the global hegemony of the multinational pharmaceutical industry and how this influences policymaking, regimes of governance, as well as global pharmaceutical production, circulation, and consumption. So I will hand over to Kaushik now. Thank you very much for being here.
So thanks, Mary. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here in this conversation, in this format. So thanks also to Fabian and Klaus for inviting me. And it's also a great pleasure for me to be in conversation with Emilia, who's an old friend. We've been in conversation for many years, but never in this particular kind of format. So that's also something I look forward to. Unfortunately, I don't have, I don't perform in any ways, so I'm just going to talk, and I'm going to talk with minimal slides that say very little. So what we thought we would do is that I would talk first, and then we would sit together and have a bit of a chit chat, and then open it up. Okay, and what I'm talking about today is the appropriation of health by capital. Right? So what does it mean when health becomes capitalized? And this partly means what does it mean when health care becomes capitalized, but it also means what does it mean when the idea of health, what health means, what we assume it means, when that idea gets capitalized. What does that mean for our embodied healthiness? What does it mean for access to medicines and treatment? And what does it mean for bodies that are differentially incorporated, in every sense of the word, into biomedical regimes in different parts of the world? Right? Now, this is a big question, and as an anthropologist, I tend to enter these big questions through very specific entry points and specific sets of stories. So in the work that I've done, I've asked these questions really following two specific empirical trajectories out of India. Right? And that's what got me into studying this issue and these questions. So the first thing to bear in mind, the first set of trajectories, is that there's a contestation between two different modes and relations of capitalist production. One is the Euro-American research and development-driven pharmaceutical industry, the so-called innovator industry, which bases its business model on making new drugs. These companies tend to be publicly traded and financialized and are sustained by monopoly protection offered by drug patents. The other is the generics industry, which reverse engineers drugs that are already on the market and sells them in a free market. The Indian pharmaceutical industry is one of the strongest generics manufacturers in the world, enabled by India's 1970 patent law, which only allowed process patents and not product patents on drugs. So this meant that in India you could not patent a drug molecule, only its method of manufacture. Consequently, drug prices in India became among the lowest in the world, and the Indian industry emerged as a major source of medication for much of the global south. However, once India signed the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights or TRIPS agreement, enshrined under the aegis of the World Trade Organization or the WTO, it had to institute a product patent regime by 2005. So now India allows the same 20-year patent on drug molecules as the United States and Europe, and so this is a shift to monopoly capitalism. So there are tensions here between so-called innovator and generics companies, between free market and monopoly capitalism, and these tensions revolve around the patent. So it's revolved around harmonizing patent regimes globally with Euro-American ones. So there are links here to the politics of global trade. Since the 1990s, one has seen so that's one set of movements that I was interested in. The second set of movements is that since the 1990s, one has seen the increased outsourcing of clinical trials from the United States to global peripheries. These trials are necessary to establish the safety and efficacy of a drug in development. They're capital intensive and filled with market risk, and they require human experimental subjects. At the same time, therapeutic consumption and prescription rates in the US have increased with no signs of reduction. Hence, even as experimental subjectivity has emerged as a new form of biomedical labor, American patient consumers have come to be therapeutically saturated. And this is an actors category in clinical trials. Americans are problematic because they're therapeutically saturated. They're on so many drugs that it's quite difficult to do a clinical trial on them without having all of these drug-drug interactions that muddy the data. Right? So there are links then between experimental subjectivity around the world, especially in the global south, alongside therapeutic saturation of the American population. So that's the second dynamic. Right? Now, even as India shifted to a product patent regime in 2005, it passed legislation that globally harmonized its clinical trials regulations with a view to attracting trials from the US and Europe and the West. This means that just as a new monopolistic patent regime was being instituted, India was constructing itself as a global experimental hub, brandishing its populations as experimental subjects. So if the American structure sees clinical trials outsourcing combined with therapeutic saturation, the Indian structure sees the intensification of experimental subjectivity alongside a curtailment of access to essential medicines. So this is the perverse structure of global pharmaceutical political economy that I wanted to understand. And so to elucidate that, I'm going to turn to Karl Marx. So this is going to get a little esoteric, but I'm going to do a little bit of Marx in 10 minutes, because that's very important to what comes afterwards. So Marx showed how capitalist value is not a thing but a process, specifically a process of self-valorization. And if there's nothing else you take back from this talk, take this back. This is Marx in a nutshell. Value is value because it makes more value. This is fundamental to the dynamics of capital. This value realizes through exchange, but value is something more than or other than exchange. So Marx begins his analysis in volume 1 of Capital by discussing 3 types of value: use value, exchange value, and a third which he refers to simply as value. And this third category of value, which is distinct from the first 2, is the foundation of capital, and it's defined by self-valorization. So after introducing this question of value as additional to and distinct from use and exchange, Marx analyzes the commodity form and the money form. He asks the riddle of commodity and monetary exchange in capital, which is that the apparent exchange of equivalence, mediated by money as simply a means and measure of that exchange, leads, indeed must lead, to a generation of surplus for money to be capital. So in his schema, if you have exchange MCM, money for commodity for money, for a capitalist, that exchange has to result in MCM prime, where M prime is more than M. You put money into commodity circulation, you need to get more money back. That's when money becomes capital. That's the magic of capital, and that's at the heart of this definition of this third term, value, which Marx reveals as surplus value. So just as he's introducing this concept, he writes this remarkable paragraph, and I'm going to leave it up for the rest of my talk, so I don't have to read out the whole thing, but basically he's talking about what's happening in the circulation of MCM, different modes of existence of value itself, constantly changing from one form to the other. But I want to emphasize certain things that he's saying here, right? It's constantly changing from one form to the other, without becoming lost in this movement, it thus becomes transformed into an automatic subject. If we pin down the specific forms of the appearance assumed in term by self-valorizing value in the course of its life, the life of value, we reach these following elucidations. In truth, however, value is the subject, i.e. the independently acting agent. Value valorizes itself independently. By virtue of being value, it has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself. So here Marx is showing that value does not simply express utility or exchange, it acquires its own subjectivity. This subjectivity depends upon the alienation of the workers through an appropriation of labor. For one cannot understand the mystery of non-equivalence at the heart of purportedly equivalent exchange, Marx says, the way political economists do, by assuming that the value of a commodity is a function of labor time, remunerated in wage. For M to have the potential to become M prime greater than M, there must always exist the potential for the worker to labor more than that which is remunerated in wage. Marx terms this potential labor power. So the methodological insight here, and this is relevant as I subsequently extend this analysis to health, is that capital generates value through an exploitation of bodily potential, even as the generation of value becomes an end in itself. As creative potential, labor power is not predetermined value. Therefore, this apparent act of equivalent exchange, workers' labor for capitalist wages, has hidden within it an element of non-equivalence, because wages are fixed remuneration, but the labor, which is actually labor power, is the potential for the creation of value over and above the money expended in wages. So surplus value in general, Marx says, is value in excess of the equivalent. Further, value is that which allows the commodity, which is always the product of specific and concrete human labor, to figure as abstract labor, something that can just be quantified, independent of the subjective experience of laboring. So value is an abstraction device. Even as value contains this own internal dynamics, it's never a thing in itself. It materializes in real-world historical situations in institutional forms. So one of the things that I'm interested in specifically is how capitalist value materializes in biomedicine, which is an industry that's heavily financialized and monopolized, and how it materializes in the context of the globalization of biomedicine. Right? So that's something that I want to end with. But there's a further anthropological wrinkle here when one is thinking about biomedicine, which is that capitalist value dynamics of biomedicine implode with the ethical and the moral, with non-market values. Right? And this is particularly salient for the biotech and pharmaceutical industries, which, as they keep telling us, are in the business of making health and saving lives. So market valuation, therefore, depends upon notions of value that are somehow deemed external to the market, even as ethics gets incorporated into the market. So what this means is that the actual expression of value dynamics in different places and times is extremely political, in ways that consolidate and contest capitalist modes and relations of production. So here's a biomedical analogy. Think of capitalist value as an oncogene. We all have oncogenes in our genome, genes which in various ways stimulate different kinds of cellular division. Oncogenes are essential. They're lively, vital, integral to the ways in which our cells produce and reproduce themselves. However, they have a tendency, unless regulated and kept in check, to function in ways that are out of control. This is cancer. How an oncogene expresses itself, however, varies from individual to individual. Certain risk factors might increase the risk of malignancy, but whether, when, and how any particular individual develops any particular cancer is ultimately contingent, a function of a complex combination of genetic, epigenetic, and environmental factors. Similarly, self-valorizing value is inherent to capital. You cannot have capital without a value that becomes a thing in itself that wants to keep making more of itself. This is what makes capital so productive. including of new drugs, new technologies, new interventions into life and health. This value, however, cannot regulate itself. It needs to keep making more of itself, to keep valorizing. And this valorization requires an exploitation of bodily potential. Therefore, the limits to the self-valorization of bodily potential, unless imposed from the outside, are to exhaust bodily potential, to suck the life out of the bodies that value depends upon for its life. Just as malignant cancer cells are so out of control in their productivity that they kill the very body that sustains them, so too can capitalist value become malignant without regulation, limited ultimately only by the limits of the bodies they depend and prey upon. So capital ideally, for instance, would love for workers to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without pay. The reason it cannot do that is because workers would die. The long history of aspiration for the worker who can work without limits, from the history of slavery to the dream of robotics, is driven by the need of capitalist value for the maximal consumption of bodily potential. And so that's the dynamic, that's the logic of capital, but how it comes to be regulated becomes a historical, contingent, political question that varies from place to place and time to time. So with that sort of quick lesson in Marx, now I'm in a position to talk about what this means for health. I'm going to introduce this concept of surplus health. So this question, as I said, for Marx is that the condition of possibility for self-valorizing value lies in the theft of the worker's non-adequately remunerated bodily potential for labor, surplus labor. So what does that mean for health? Joseph Dumit has provided the most literal answer to this question through his notion of surplus health, an analogy to Marxian surplus labor. And for more on this, I would recommend his truly remarkable book, Drugs for Life. Surplus health refers to the market value that pharmaceutical capital gains from the potential for future illness of those who might one day consume drugs, which includes anyone with the buying power to constitute a market for therapeutics and excludes those without. Dumit studied the growth of pharmaceutical marketing in the United States in the second half of the 20th century and its imbrication with the growth of clinical trials, a trajectory that has resulted in the progressive growth of prescription rates with no signs of stopping. And what Dumit did was he literally took keywords in the labor theory of value, thought of what the analogous keywords would be for a health theory of value, did a search and replace in volume 1, and came up with BioMarx Experiment 1. And you can see what a careful writer Marx is because it reads remarkably well. What Marx wrote for industrial capital applies to pharmaceutical capital if you get the keywords right. Okay? So if one is a pharmaceutical company, one cannot simply be in the business of maintaining health. One has to grow it. In order to do so, health must become measurable, quantitative, and aggregate potentiality that can be valorized. In other words, health has to be abstracted, just as labor has to be abstracted. In such a logic, the curing of disease or healthy living is a threat to capital accumulation. If you become healthy, you stop taking drugs and you stop being valuable to the pharmaceutical industry, right? It's very important that you have health, but not that you can be healthy. It's a very important difference. Right? And so the labor of therapeutic consumption is valorized in bodies that have the potential for illness. An example of this is the relationship between cholesterol levels and the prescription of statins. If one's cholesterol reaches a certain level, then it makes sense to take a statin. At this moment of making sense, the individual who is interpolated into taking a statin is simultaneously a patient, regardless of whether she feels ill or not, and a consumer. What makes this rational, even sensible, such that not taking a statin would be an unwise thing to do, is a history of clinical trials that have provided an epistemic basis for such an action, right? So now health becomes a number, your cholesterol risk factor, and it becomes really stupid, perhaps even immoral, to not tailor your life to that number because the clinical trials tell you so. However, there is virtually no clinical trial that tells us when it's a good idea to stop taking a statin, because all the trials that are designed are about getting us to consume more drugs, right? So the epistemology here is completely implicated with a certain market logic that is about therapeutic consumption and growing health, not about being healthy. And of course, drugs are harmful molecules. They have side effects, right? But we don't know what they are because the studies haven't been done. Okay, so that's the concept of surplus health. The other Marxian concept that I want to introduce now is what Marx calls living labor. This is an equally vital in every sense concept that lies at the heart of his analysis and speaks to the collective labor which is not merely exploited but also has the power to negate that exploitation, within which resides the possibility of a communist alternative to capitalist modes and relations of production. Living labor is intimately related to the question of the exploitability and reproduction of labor, of bodily potential for capital, which is, as feminist Marxists have insisted for decades, linked to the question of the reproduction of life. And I want to introduce now a specific Marxian feminist reading of biomedical value concerning living and reproductive labor alongside Dumits, which is what Melinda Cooper and Catherine Walby call clinical labor. So Cooper and Walby speak to the engendering of new forms of labor in biomedical economies, bringing together labor in relation to new reproductive technologies, oocyte donation being exemplary, with forms of labor operational in pharmaceutical development, especially the labor of experimental subjectivity in clinical trials. Their analysis has additionally been resonant in thinking about forms of contracted reproductive labor, such as surrogacy. Right? So what one gets then, like Dumit, is Cooper and Walby are reading Marx's analysis as an exploitation of bodily potential as the mechanism for creating self-valorizing value for capital, but there are subtle differences. Dumit shows how capital's potential to appropriate domains beyond labor, not just surplus labor, but surplus health. Cooper and Walby, meanwhile, are concerned with the expansion of domains of labor, the production of new kinds of labor with new modes of production, new forms of living labor, such as new forms of living labor within new reproductive technologies. The further wrinkle is that the prescription maximization and therapeutic saturation that Dumit explains is very much located in the so-called First World, the United States for sure, but of course the First World exists throughout pockets of the Global South. The exploited bodies of surrogates, oocyte donors, and experimental subjects that Cooper and Walby described are invariably marked bodies, raced, gendered, and post-colonial. So what one sees is the expansion of domains of self-valorizing value alongside international divisions of biomedical and clinical labor. Right? Okay. So the political question that arises here then is, how does one even think a public health in the context of this structure? Right? Okay. The last sort of piece of context that I want to give you here is something about the institutional landscape of corporate biomedicine, and especially of the pharmaceutical industry. And what I want to say here very, very quickly and simply is that most R&D-driven pharmaceutical companies are publicly traded. This means that value for these companies is not dependent on profit as much as on growth. And they're answerable to financial markets and speculative capital. In other words, this industry is heavily financialized. So you have a certain activist discourse that talks about the greedy pharmaceutical industry because, oh, it's so profitable and it's still trying to... The thing is that the pharmaceutical industry is itself in crisis because profits don't matter, growth does. And so from the perspective of financial markets that are determining how valuable they are, they need to constantly self-valorize. It's not enough to make money, it's important to grow money, right? So what one has then is this sort of structure of crisis that's built in because growing money means making more and more drugs and having more and more people consume more and more drugs. And there's been what is called an innovation deficit for various reasons in the pharmaceutical industry, right? So there haven't been new drugs coming through the pipeline. So this question of how do you grow markets without new drugs? And let's remember here that new drugs that do not constitute profitable markets, such as drugs for neglected diseases of the Global South, are not valuable to the pharmaceutical industry. Right? So how do you grow markets without making new drugs that are not valuable to you becomes a sort of structural crisis for this industry. Right? And so there's something about the structural relationship here between financialization, corporatization, and monopoly capitalism, which has a long 20th century history that I want to allude to. Right? And the thing that I want to say here, and I'm going to gloss this over very quickly because then I want to wrap up by thinking about the question of politics, right? Is we're at this moment, it's very important but also easy to talk just about the capitalization of life or the commodification of life. But I think it's very important to understand that we're at a historical moment that sees the corporatization of biomedicine and its globalization alongside the financialization of life. That's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as commodification. And there was a moment akin to this 100 years ago when there were debates about financialization and monopoly capitalism, and two trenchant critiques that came out at the same time. One in America by Thorstein Veblen, who was invested in saving liberalism. He wrote this book, The Vested Interests and the Common Man. And the other, Vladimir Lenin, in the now just formed Soviet Union, who was invested in destroying capitalism, who wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and they basically make the same argument. And the argument is, as Veblen calls it, it's an argument against monopoly capitalism, right? And it's an argument that, as Lenin says, is one that sees production becoming social but appropriation remaining private. And as the mode of appropriation changes towards more speculative activities, and this was happening 100 years ago, what one sees is the supersession of commodity production by financial manipulation. Right? This is the history of deindustrialized parts of the world, including the Ruhr Valley, right? Is that commodity production gets superseded by financial speculation. And so what one has then is the violence of deindustrialization alongside the consolidation of monopoly capital, right? And so what Lenin also points to then is the important role of the banks, which were themselves undergoing a period of consolidation into monopolies. And so what one gets is a concentration of capital, a growth of bank turnover, leading to the transformation of scattered capitalists into what Lenin calls the collective capitalist. And what Veblen, almost sort of mirroring Lenin, says from a very different political vantage point, is that what that means is that even industrial capital now functions in the cause of the corporation. And what the corporation is a formal coalition of ownership. In other words, it becomes a sort of coterie or a cabal of ownership that now controls these dynamics of self-valorizing value and gets monopolized into a handful of entities that are able to control commodity flows, but also financial flows. Right? And when one understands the dynamic of the contemporary pharmaceutical industry, it's very important to understand that pharmaceutical companies don't make drugs that much these days, but they do control global financial flows. They almost act like investment banks themselves. They act like investment banks in determining what kinds of investments in health are made, but they also literally themselves act as agents on the stock market. So the big oil and big pharma have been engaging in stock price manipulation through stock buybacks at an enormously intense level over the past couple of decades. Right? So there's something about the structure of financialization and the ways in which financialization impacts these dynamics of self-valorizing value that are important to understand. So now finally, the final section of the talk then is considering the question of politics. How to think a genuinely public health in an economy dominated by the self-valorization of value and monopolized speculative corporatism. Right? Basically, I've painted you a bleak picture. And the structure is a perverse and bleak structure. Now, public health as it has manifested itself, right, both in its progressive Keynesian welfare state varieties and especially in its Keynesian varieties, has tended to be about getting the state to equitably distribute health benefits, so therapeutic access, hospital care, and so on, and constrain the expansion of harmful biomedical intervention. So you have to have good clinical practice under which you can conduct clinical trials, and so on and so forth. Right? So it operates under this idea of a certain civil society social contract for healthcare. This has tended to be the focus of civil society and patient advocacy, and especially in the global south, has often involved judicial intervention. And there's a whole story to tell about the role of judicialization in the politics of healthcare access, especially in the global south. And a lot of this sort of instantiates around national state forms of governance. Very important, politically very vital. But then the question to be asked is, how does one deal with that at a moment of a virulent attack on the welfare state on the one hand, and on these dynamics of speculative financialized capital that are often operating at suprastate levels, that are often operating at global and transnational levels through things like bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Right? So there's something that's both very important about the welfare state ideal of public health, but that's already sort of structurally constrained by the scales at which global capital operates. Right? And that's what leads to this sort of situation of generalized crisis. Okay. So what this means then is basically within this structure, everyone is screwed, right? There are inequities in access to health. Marked global southern bodies especially are subjected to experiments, clinical trials experiments without getting therapeutic access. First world bodies, wherever they might be, are therapeutically saturated. And even the industry itself is in crisis, right? It's not like anybody is benefiting from this. But the other thing that I want to point to in terms of the political consequences of this is that the collective that opposes a capitalized health is not a given. If a certain Marxist imagination of communism is grounded in the call for workers of the world to unite, then it's not clear that there are structural grounds for solidarity or even shared identification amongst the subjects of biomedicine in all its divisions and multiplications of labor. And so if we follow these dynamics, if we follow the value dynamics of capital, we recognize that both the therapeutically saturated first world consumer and the so-called third world experimental subject, who's potentially denied access to essential medications, are exploited. They're both exploited subjects. But because of the differentiation in the forms of bodily exploitation, it becomes very, and especially the reproductive body of the third world woman as the especially marked site of exploited biomedical labor, it's very difficult to conceptualize what a politics of collectivity would look like in that situation that genuinely builds solidarity without just an appropriation of certain kinds of voices and bodies. Right? So how to think politics out of such a structure? That's the conversation that I want to have with Emilia and with all of you. Right? Given the practical difficulties of thinking in analogy to workers of the world unite. Right? So as a rough draft towards thinking this, a sort of manifesto-like thinking this, I want to suggest some of the following. The first is that a politics that does not acknowledge, engage, and contest the dynamics of self-valorizing value is utopian and theological. This engagement and contestation requires the organization of living labor, but living labor is not a vital and organic force in itself. It's striated, differentiated, distributed, and it often functions at odds with itself. Right? Solidarity is not a given. So this question of how one thinks solidarities of living labor in the face of dynamics of self-valorizing value becomes an important question. And an example of the difficulties of these kinds of solidarities from some of this research I've done. Right? So think here of the case of the pricing of the anti-leukemia drug Gleevec in Korea. Novartis, the manufacturers of Gleevec, insisted on pricing the drug at the same price point that it was selling in the United States, and the Korean government was pressurized not to institute price controls that would make the drug more affordable. And there are reasons for that. Leukemia patient groups, and this is South Korea, leukemia patient groups mobilized against this alongside HIV patient groups who had long been involved in policy battles around affordable drug pricing in order to facilitate access to essential medication. Novartis responded by striking a deal with the Korean government, whereby the government and Novartis together would subsidize 90% of the cost of the drug, such that leukemia patients would only have to pay 10%, even as the price of the drug would not be formally restricted. It's very important for these companies to not have different prices for the drug in different parts of it. Leukemia patients who were facing a life and death situation were happy with an outcome that made an essential medication more accessible. HIV/AIDS groups who were fighting for principles of price control that would be more broadly applicable across diseases and therapeutics were opposed to the compromise. Thus, Novartis succeeded simultaneously in preventing the Korean government from controlling the price of its drug, even as it managed to divide patient advocacy groups. The HIV/AIDS patient groups in this case articulated the structurally transformative position, one that would change the terms and conditions of drug pricing in Korea. Yet it would be an abomination to suggest that leukemia patients abandon the chance of a life-saving compromise in exchange for a policy principle. Thus, the dynamics of self-valorizing value intercalate with deeply charged ethical and moral situations to further the interests of corporate capital. Even as solidarities have to be forged, the forging of solidarities in any particular situation of health and illness, life and death, is not a given. Therefore, there are situations in which the structurally transformative position, oriented towards more socialized health, could in fact not just be politically difficult, but morally fraught. Consider, for instance, the politics of antiretroviral access in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa. Medication existed to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Pharmaceutical companies were willing to make this medication, nevirapine, available. Yet the Thabo Mbeki government, in a notorious case of AIDS denialism, refused to make it available through the public health system until it was forced to do so by the South African Constitutional Court. Now, on the one hand, Mbeki's position, which insisted that AIDS was caused by poverty and not the virus, was a dangerously anti-scientific position which was vilified by the scientific community. Yet, ironically, Mbeki was articulating a structural political economic critique of systemic inequality and its relationship to disease. This was difficult to hear, cloaked as it was in its own conspiracy theories, but also in the midst of an epidemic that had assumed the dimensions of a national emergency, such that immediate inaction at the altar of long-term structural transformation was scandalous. In the end, the possibility of structural critique was actually, the structural critique was the problematic position. Pharmaceuticalized intervention was the morally correct answer, right? So it's very difficult to just make structural critiques in these situations because they're so fraught. So both the welfare state and free market capitalism, therefore, are essential strategic allies and interlocutors in fights for more equitable access, even as sometimes they become the obstacles to structural transformation. Even as the South African executive under Mbeki emerged as the villain in the battle around antiretroviral access, it was the South African state through its judiciary that ensured the most equitable outcome under the circumstances. So it calls for a very sophisticated strategic sort of politics towards the state, where one also has to recognize that the state is often not one thing, and often activists had to sort of play off different arms of the state against each other. And one sees this kind of strategic alliance making towards market entities as well, including Indian generics companies, right? So you have these brutal logics of self-valorizing value, but often politically the need to make strategic engagements with the very practitioners who perpetuate these brutal logics, right? And so the kinds of things that then fall out, for instance, are the possibility of something like a public sector pharmaceutical industry, which is much rarer to imagine, right? It becomes a contest between which is the more noble form of capitalism that we fight for. That becomes what patient advocates are often doing. Okay? But the other thing I want to say is that given that, there is also a fight to be had for free market capitalism against monopolized capitalism, right? And that becomes a sort of strategic and tactical battle as well. One might want to fight for socialized health, but within that one has to recognize that there are battles within capitalism, and those battles are often quite brutal, right, between capitalist entities. And so the sort of strategic activation of those battles become important. But finally, and this is a more obvious thing to say when I leave America, but it's actually a very difficult thing to say every time I speak in the US, because America is such a bloody parochial country. A collective politics must imagine and articulate transnational responses to global capital. National state interventions, however progressive, are necessarily curtailed and reactive to the deterritorialized movements of capital that are strengthened by geopolitical machinations of investor states that are captured by financialized monopoly capital. So what sort of a transnational collectivity towards healthiness as opposed to health might mean is a question that I hope we can wrestle with together. So I'll leave it at
that. So thank you very much, Kaushik. And now the two of you have time to talk about topics you addressed in your input, or also maybe to broaden if that's even possible, the perspective, and I try to interfere as little as possible, only if I have the feeling that maybe this could become a little bit more leveled for us to understand. Okay. And then afterwards, we will have time to open up to questions for the audience. So.
Okay. Oh, thanks.
So I'm going to just start by saying what a pleasure it is always to have a presentation of Marx from you, because that is a performance and it is a way into this very indeed esoteric realm of decrypting. So for me it's been, I think we've been in about a decade of engagement in conversation. Our conversation started in a very different moment in history, and it's been very interesting to sort of reflect from that. I was thinking about the generic industry, the generic pharmaceutical industry in Brazil, and you in India. And of course, the states that were, engaged, and the activist politics that were surrounding these were already 10 years on, we can say, of a different era, and that's absolutely terrifying, to in light of the things that Louisa presented earlier, to take stock of that. So there's a deeply situated historically nature to this question, and I think the work that you're doing around sort of this deep decrypting of what this apparatus is, which is so opaque and so complex to understand, for me in my own trajectory and in thinking about the things that I'm looking at, have been deeply important. So I want to come back to this question of what does this appropriation of health by capital do to our understanding of health and our this question of the role of the state, we're back to almost a question of a utopia of public health. Speaking from Brazil, I began fieldwork in Brazil in 2004, and that was barely 15 years on from the constitution, the post-military dictatorship constitution. The SUS, the public health service in Brazil, was in its adolescence, as public health workers like to tell me, and there was a very particular kind of moment that I was witnessing, and it's very intense to think about what was being included, what was excluded, what were the hopes and aspirations around that, and what did health mean in that context, and what can it come to mean in this new context. So one of the things that I think is very important in what you're showing and in the sort of decrypting that you do is to show how basically this story of biocapital, of the production of surplus health through Joe Dumit's work, shows us how health has become sort of politically, ethically, in terms of, ethics as value, and institutionally through the sort of forging of institutionalized sort of regulatory norms and institutions, pharmaceuticalized, deeply pharmaceuticalized. So there is this equation between health and access to drugs, or health and drug. And even when the drug is not present in the intervention, I spend 5 years researching public health nutrition and the sort of the questions that are raised around the obesity crisis and food sovereignty and access to decent food. And so even when there isn't a pharmaceutical at the heart of these questions, the model, the regulatory, ideological model that drives what we can know and what we can validate and fund through national health services is completely and utterly formed by the RCT, the randomized controlled trial, and the way it has in turn shaped evidence-based medicine, the metricization of health that you describe in relation to this project of biocapital and surplus health. So we now have this equation between health and drugs. And we have this very difficult political kind of situation in which we're forced to almost make a decision or to hold together two very polarized sort of aspirations, one could say, and one is the decolonial kind of aspiration that Louisa so beautifully exposed, which is to sort of remind ourselves again and again of the violence, you know, in the sort of the clinical labor narrative, the violence that producing these medicines has been and continues to be. It's not in the past, and so, you know. And at the same time, the impossibility of refusing them and the need to continue to fight for access. So there's this profound tension that is there. And at the heart of that tension is what kind of a position we want to have in relation to the state. And that you evoked in your talk how, you know, there are different bodies of the state that activists have traditionally leveraged in this process. But the state is not static, as we're so brutally learning in this moment in history, right? The state becomes appropriated by different forms, you know, and our regulatory, I mean, what's happening at the European Commission at the moment is this invasion of anti-institutionalists who are colonizing these institutions to demolish them. So we're now in this very strange position where these institutions that we have been deeply critical of, have spent years deconstructing, are now something that we also have to hold on to for dear life. So that's the core of the situation. That's the kind of diagnostic of the situation that is raised by this problem of, you know, what does it mean for health to have been appropriated by capital? I wanted to also maybe just respond on this question of growing health and having health but never being healthy. And maybe I'll just open this up in relation to the fieldwork that I've begun to do more recently around the psychedelic renaissance and looking at, you know, in the wake of this sort of innovation pipeline dry up, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have drugs to put out, and there's this crisis, and this crisis is very productive, of course, and very generative financially. And, you know, people are on these heavy regimes of medication that we know do not work, and there is, because the whole regime of evidence that has been so carefully and meticulously built up over decades of industry funding of, you know, mental health research, it is not possible to demonstrate efficacy for other types of interventions. This is this question of the pharmaceuticalization of the whole kind of infrastructure of defining what is even health. And what's very interesting in this moment, so, you know, one strategy as analysts is to sort of look to where are you know, spaces of the otherwise, where are alternatives, where is resistance happening, what are people doing? Because everyone in these fields is, you know, has a different angle, has an awareness from a different angle of the deep crisis that is at work. And so people in the mental health field that are mobilizing around psychedelic compounds are doing so, as I explained in the talk, around this idea that it's not the substance, it's the substance plus the care, plus the container, plus the therapy, and it's the interaction between those two. And what I find really fascinating, what I'm interested in looking at ethnographically, is how the challenges that they're faced with in pushing that kind of an understanding through a regulatory apparatus that has been forged to show a magic bullet effect. Outcome, to show, like, you know, an intervention and its outcome measured according to certain kinds of metrics. And so there's one kind of space of trying to crack open something through the FDA, through the European Drug Agency. And what's interesting there is that there's a very explicit rhetoric at work, which is that, you know, for people who have treatment-resistant PTSD, they're on heavy regimes of multiple cocktails of mental health drugs, and they're not working for them. They're stabilizing symptoms, so they're, you know, it's a different story to the statin story, but it's a similar one in terms of its suppression management, its symptom suppression or management rather than cure or treatment or yes, whatever we want to call this, healing perhaps. And their narrative, a lot of the people I'm speaking to in that field are saying that, industry is terrified of this, because should this be demonstrated, should a regime of evidence, should, there be enough of a result in the phase 3, then there is a sort of legitimacy for these very, very different approaches to take people off these regimes. So it's a kind of antidote to surplus health. Mm-hmm. So that's one place we can begin to look, but it's this profound question of what does healing mean in the context of the pharmaceuticalization of health.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Emilia. I mean, I agree with everything that you've said, and this is a really wonderful framing of so many things. I want to pick up on maybe just one thing that you were sort of veering towards the end, right? In order to think about, what kinds of work we potentially do as analysts, and also what kinds of conversations might be emergent in spaces like this that we can think about in relation to that work, right? So I think that one thing that we do, and certainly, this is what I know how to do as both an anthropologist and as a certain kind of Marxian critic, is that I have learned to be very good at analyzing the structures by which we are violated. And I think in and of itself, that's not an unimportant thing if it can take pedagogical form, right? I think it's important for us to understand and teach how it is that one is located within situations of structural violation. And, my way of doing it is this, but I think, for instance, of Aliens in Green, and that whole project is also about a sort of pedagogy of corporate domination of our bodily functions, right? Through the way in which corporate endocrinology interrupts and interferes with our own. And so to be able to show that in various kinds of ways, I think is important. But then the phrase that you use, of at the same time we're looking for spaces of the otherwise. And I think there's something really interesting and complementary, but, not obviously, that shares skin, but that doesn't obviously end up in the same place, between where you're looking for the otherwise, similar perhaps to where Louisa is as well, which is looking for the otherwise in other kinds of botanical and transspecies relations, versus where I'm looking for the otherwise, which is in other kinds of states, right? And I don't think that one or the other is better or worse. I think they're both very important. And in a sense, this is the horror of talking about research that I had done 10 years ago, when the idea of the state that I could be assured of in India, which, don't get me wrong, was a violent, paternalistic, neoliberalizing state, was still a state that had certain affordances that are completely being shut down in the current fascist moment in India. Right? So the head of the Lawyers Collective, for instance, who fought the battle around access to this anti-cancer drug Gleevec, who then became the UN Commissioner for Health and Human Rights, is being individually targeted now by the current Indian government for his NGO activity, saying that all of this UN stuff means that there's foreign money that's being flown into NGO activity. And so he's directly being targeted through sort of tax harassment and so on, and being prevented from doing the work that he's doing. Feminist groups that I've worked closely with, who are my comrades who work on women and health issues, who have been at the heart of publicizing unethical clinical trials, directly being targeted through these kinds of mechanisms. Oh, are you getting money from Dutch funding? What does that mean? We're directly sort of... So there are ways in which the state is just violently shutting down. And I have to say, this is a bit of a cop-out, but my recent research has moved to South Africa. And I realized that one of the reasons why South Africa has been so important for me, just existentially, is that it reminds me of an India that's lost. And that I think is very hard to, as in, again, deeply violent state that lots of people are extremely unhappy with, but one is still fighting with the state for something. It's not just a fight for survival against a fascist state, right? And so, but also the sort of importance for me to think about other kinds of states is a methodological insistence that when we think about technological development of any kind, even of the most powerfully corporatized varieties, it is not just the case that technology happens and our lives get redetermined. That's always mediated by states, right? The possibility for corporate, for a technocratic corporatization to have such a powerful hold is almost always mediated by states that construct markets in the interests of capital rather than the interests of its people, right? So there, the place of the state and the place of the law and the question of under what conditions do states become investor states as opposed to welfare states? In what conditions can states be held accountable to its populations as opposed to its corporations? Those remain very important questions, and I think they're questions of democracy. Yeah. And let's remember, I mean, fascism and Nazism in Europe in the 1930s was about the corporatization of the state, right? That's what it was.
Should we open it up, or do you want me to respond to that?
It's up to you.
I think the only response I can give to that is that for me, being in dialogue with you is just a constant reminder to not leave that out of the story that I'm telling, the stories that I tell. So, and again, that brings up a struggle always, as we deal with questions such as indigeneity, and of course, the state violence towards indigenous people is spectacular. So it's deeply ambivalent to do that. But I really appreciate the reminder that I think it's a really important thing that you're putting on the table again and again, and confronting people to sort of respond to this issue. Where is what's at stake? I mean, I've been reading a lot of science fiction recently, and the state figures in very interesting ways as absent in a lot of Ursula Le Guin's work, Octavia Butler's work, and that absence is terrifying in that work. So so we have to think carefully about this moment, and for me it's a real I haven't come to any kind of a clear position on this, but it's something that this project also the new work is emergent around this, and I'm thinking with that a lot.
Yeah. And just quickly, one thing in relation to that, very important in relation to the politics of indigeneity, but also vital in relation to feminist politics, right? So, I've been in dialogue with the Argentinian feminist scholar and activist Veronica Gago, who has been talking a lot about the ways in which resistance in Argentina from below is entirely women's resistance. And the question of the relationship to the state there is deeply antagonistic. And this question has haunted Indian feminism since independence, certainly since the birth of a feminist movement, so at least for 30 years, of how does Indian feminism relate itself to the state? Is the state a fundamentally patriarchal entity that has to be fought, or is it an entity that can ultimately save us from the worst excesses, not just of capitalism, but of communitarianism, which is deeply patriarchal as well? So it's a really difficult It's a really difficult dilemma.
It's a labor-intensive question because to rely on that requires phenomenal energy for those marked bodies, and that's why there is such an ambivalence, and there is such rage and anger, and there is such resistance to doing it. Because that story, there are certain subject positions for whom leveraging the state is a more obvious avenue.
That's right.
So thank you so much to the two of you. I think we could open up this discussion now to your questions and comments. And is there a spontaneous question already? Yeah, over there. Okay, so I think we share this one thing now. Okay.
You answer it.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for this wonderful talk on this discussion. Maybe you could try to elaborate a nexus a bit, or you haven't elaborated this, but elaborate a nexus between the state and corporations and the pedagogy you were mentioning that's important to you in sort of executing Marxist critique. Maybe you could talk a bit about what role does the university as a site of knowledge production play for you, and how can the struggles be sort of brought to this platform?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really vital question at this moment. And it's a vital question for me in three locations, right? Because now I'm sort of split across these three locations that I know to different degrees, and in different ways, which is the US, India, and more very recently, South Africa, right? And this is a very high stakes question because on the one hand, the American university in particular, right, and certainly the private American university, such as where I teach, is very much an ivory tower. And it is the sort of ivory tower where it's very easy then for work such as mine to simply circulate in self-referential ways amongst a group of people whom I have cited, and we can be very comfortable with that. And the structure of the university itself doesn't provide incentives from breaking out of that, right? It's also, the American university is a very powerful site for the instantiation of the globalization of public health as global health. So if you want to think about where does the public health in India come from, right? It comes almost exclusively from the Harvard School of Public Health, from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and from the Gates Foundation. And the money is tied between those places, right? So the American university is very important here, and it's very powerful. And speaking within the university then ends up having, in some ways, a limited function, especially for the more humanistic knowledge, but also a very hegemonic function in terms of how expertise travels outwards, right? And one of the things that I want to say here is that I also think that paradigm of global health, public health as global health, is one that violently suppresses the idea of an earlier internationalist health that came much more from the global south through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that was very much the part of the project of anti-colonialism, and that sort of manifested in things like the Alma-Ata Declaration in the late 1970s, right? And that's been eviscerated by a global health model that's all about securing global capital at the expense of other kinds of international solidarities of people. Having said that, the American university remains a relatively safe space. So it becomes a space where it is possible to make certain kinds of interventions that at this moment, the Indian university is being decimated by the attack on the authoritarian state, right? And by decimated, I mean the state going in to student dorm rooms and arresting students for being quote unquote anti-national, right? So it is a constrained space in the West, but it's also a space of affordance, because one can still, this may change, but one can still speak from the Western university. The South African university is very interesting because it's a space of radical and violent decolonization at this moment. So everyone in the South African university is asking, what does it mean to be in the university? What is the place of the university? So it's a really interesting historical question, and the answer to it is really different in different places. And so thinking affordances out of that, I think, becomes a strategic question.
I'll just add really quickly, so speaking from France, which is sort of in this very bizarre moment of neoliberal reform, and there's this figure that is haunting a lot of sort of French institutional reform at the moment, which is the public-private partnership, PPP, and that's true in education, in health, in research. And the way in which, I mean, there's a whole story to tell about the way in which industry is coming into partnership for, you know, this win-win kind of model. And so the way in which we as actors within these institutions, I mean, it's redefining in a very radical way what public means. And so, you know, there's different specters on the horizon for us in France, looking towards the UK, for example, towards the US, and I'm not clear what it is that French bureaucrats have in mind as they lead these reforms. But this question of the injection of private capital into the value making of, you know, good research is really fundamental to the question that you raise. Yeah.
The next question is right here at the front.
I want to follow up what you mentioned already. Could you, in terms of analysis, could you give us, if you know it, an analysis a bit what the Gates Foundation is doing in terms? They are investing a huge amount of money in neglected tropical diseases, and what I have seen so far in my beginning of studying it, they are assembling different actors. So there is the state universities. It's mostly this university you mentioned, but also very classical colonial places of research, and then they also attract kind of open publishing ideas and open patent models, which collaborate with them, and even activists groups which somehow assembled and also sent around. And so what is this kind of actor now in your analysis of the structural violence doing? You mentioned it already with this globalizing the medicine, yeah?
Yeah. You know, it's a really difficult and a really important question, because they're a vital actor, but also an actor that we don't know a huge amount about, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do know. Right? What I know is that in the Indian context, they are a vital actor. So if you think about the institutionalization of public health in India, this is a university question, right? Pedagogically, this more or less started only in 2004. Before that, sort of public health was institutionalized in a subject as part of the medical curriculum called preventive and social medicine. And it was fairly unimportant in the curriculum. It wasn't fashionable for doctors to study that, and it basically had to do with building toilets, right? Public latrines. That was the scope of. And so to sort of institutionalize a public health in terms of public health institutions and so on, this has happened deeply, deeply, deeply in collaboration with Gates Foundation expertise, especially the Program for Appropriate Technologies in Health, or PACT. And it becomes a kind of vicious cycle, because the students who come out of the public health foundations of India end up getting hired into PACT, right? So in many ways, for the sort of pedagogical instantiation, Gates Foundation has a huge role, right? Now, what do we know about the Gates Foundation from the social sciences? Not a lot, but a couple of important pieces of work. So if you're interested, one is Lindsay McGooey, I forget the name of the book, but if you Google her, you'll find she has a book out with Verso. And that's a sort of Marxist left critique of the Gates Foundation, basically denouncing, sort of unveiling the veil and saying, look, there's imperialism behind it. Right? And the other work is the work of Manjari Mahajan, who's a political scientist at the New School, who's doing a sort of elaborate ethnographic project following Gates Foundation funded projects in India, in Bihar. And she's finding something that's much more complicated because, of course, infrastructures are being built in the process as well, right? So I think that the question to be asked is twofold. The first question to be asked is, in what ways does a foundation like the Gates Foundation, which is very much a new world order foundation, right? In what ways is it a continuation of or a change from older Cold War model foundations that had a huge impact on both medicine and agriculture in the global south, especially Rockefeller, right? And one of the major differences between Rockefeller and Gates is that Rockefeller left behind institutions in the global south. So if you think about the huge importance of Rockefeller on rice research, for instance, right, in Southeast Asia, it was completely a Cold War funded project, but it left institutions behind that then developed their own autonomous logic. Gates gives money, it doesn't build institutions the way Rockefeller did. So there's something interesting about its business model that's different. The second thing that's important is the question of accountability, right? So for me, the problem with Gates is not whether they do good work or bad work, because they obviously have a crucial role to play in public health interventions. The question is of accountability, and this is where the state remains important to me. So the big issue around which unethical clinical trials mobilized in India was an issue of a scandal around a clinical trial for and whether it was a clinical trial is a complicated issue, I'll call it a clinical trial, for the HPV vaccine. And these were some indigenous girls who were enrolled in the trial without their consent who died. And it turned out to be all sorts of ethical violations in the conduct of the trials and so on. And the trial was a public-private partnership. So it was Merck's vaccine, PACT, which is Gates Foundation funded, was coordinating the study along with the Indian Council for Medical Research and a state government minister for health and tribal welfare or something like that, right? So it's multiple contracting entities. And the thing is that when that became a scandal, and it was feminist groups in India that mobilized around these issues, and it became a huge scandal. When it became a scandal, the state showed up, at least to be yelled at, right? Like there were all these national consultations and so on, and there were people from the ICMR who were there. They didn't necessarily do anything, but the government came up with a report. It was a very complex and interesting report, but at least they were there to be yelled at. People were saying, what have you done? Tell us, tell us, tell us. And whether they answered it well or not, they were in the room and they were being asked that question. PACT disappeared. Gates was nowhere to be seen. I gave a talk about this at Harvard, and immediately I got a letter from the head of this program at PACT saying, we hear that you're talking about this at Harvard and we want to make sure you say the correct things. So here is an information sheet. And so I asked my comrades, my feminist comrades in India, have they sent you this information sheet? I said, no. Right? And so the thing is that the places where that information sheet circulated, again, was Harvard School of Public Health, Hopkins, right? The arms of US government. And this, and my friend and our mutual friend and colleague, Chris Peterson, has been studying something very similar with the shutting down of the antiretroviral tenofovir clinical trials in West Africa. And this was, again, coordinated between a pharmaceutical company and Family Health International, right? And it was the same structure of a lack of accountability, is that FHI just disappeared. And so Chris, with her comrades, have been trying to do all of this unearthing work of who were these women on the trials? What happened to them when they shut down the trials? What are the consequences for their health? And there was no accountability. And the thing to say about this, again, is that the last thing to say about groups like PACT and FHI, if one traces their genealogies, and this is Louisa, in conversation with your work, is that the reason why these organizations have so much capacity on the ground is that they started as family planning organizations in the 1970s. Right? FHI has clinical trials capacity because it was doing family planning under the aegis of the USAID in the 1970s. PACT used to be the program on advanced contraceptive technology, and then it became PACT. Right? So there's this transition from American Cold War family planning logics in the global South to neoliberal public health logics instantiated as global health and institutionalized by the Gates Foundation. And there's something about that link that's very important for us to understand it.
I just add in relation to the Gates Foundation, another author who's done really interesting work is Vinsani Adams, and her book Metrics really shows how the rise of this model imposed by the Gates Foundation is really about metrics. It's about sort of half the work, more than half the work becomes the metrics that get produced. So it's about scale. It's about scaling up, right? It's about you do one thing in one place and then you have to sort of scale it up so that it's translatable into these other localities as if place didn't matter. And what that has done is not only that Gates did not leave institutions behind, but they actually, the end result, according to sort of, the people who are gathered in this metrics edited volume, is that it totally and utterly demolished the institutions that had been so painfully put into place and left nothing in their place. So, that's just sort of to add on to that story of non-accountability and a form, something parallel to structural adjustment in a way.
Just a question. Forgive me if I take the discussion a little bit different angle. I'm very impressed and sharing your knowledge on sociological and anthropological knowledge. There are a lot of cultural practitioners in this room, and you have already mentioned that you would value also initiatives such as the performance that you have been partaking in by the Aliens in Green means of cultural shifting. And I would like to know in how far you would consider this kind of cultural shifters as actors, as kind of resistance fighters in first line, especially in this room. We have a lot of cultural practitioners, especially women, who do address the issues of medicine and self-medication, access to self-governed medicine, alternative medicine, plant-based medicine, even maybe microbiome research and so on. So just there is a shift, and you paralleled in the very beginning the industry of pharmaceutical that create the false impression of access to drugs signifying health, and in the light of the genetics industry. So you paralleled the excessive big data industry with pharmaceutical speculation, if I understand correct. So what does the actual shift towards, or from the Human Genome Project towards the Human Microbiome Project change in that logics? Is it as an epistemological shift itself already a kind of sign that the model is threatened? And you see a lot of cultural practitioners actually not only working with plants, but with bacteria and the complexity of the microbiome, which is challenging the very notion of personalized medicine on a genetic base, for example. So in how far does the combination of the shift towards a microbial turn in a certain way challenge the genetic model, and how far do you think that cultural practitioners are well suited in order to challenge the actually misinterpretation that you are criticizing? Yeah.
I'll just respond really quickly because I think this point is absolutely critical, and I'm very grateful for your question, because I think to be really rapid in my analysis around this, my sense is that the human microbiome and this whole question of sort of, to some extent, questions around planetary health, or what I was sort of gesturing at around sort of how do we bring context back in when the randomized controlled trial has carefully, meticulously purified it out, and this becomes the sole standard of evidence in medicine. And so there's all these places from which people are trying to sort of reshape or challenge or leverage ad hoc measures to sort of show, well, this individual society or this individual population or this, to refer back to what you're talking about in your talk, the scalar aspect, the individual, the population, the micro, these things are part of imaginaries, and these imaginaries have become embedded in the structures that are, the regulatory structures, the institutions, the knowledge practices, the reviewers that one has to battle in order to get these findings through peer review, and so imagination is core. Scientists are always saying that imagination is absolutely core, and challenging dominant imaginations. I think that's really where the most beautiful work in STS and science and technology studies is really about, sort of showing that it's not that it's not true. It's just that the practices that the questions that it is possible to ask of bacteria, of plants, of humans, of our relations, our complicated multiple relations to the environments within which phenomena are taking place, are deeply and profoundly shaped by very parochial, very historically and culturally situated understandings of what is the self and the other and the relation between them, and scalar questions. So I think there's a huge place for cultural practices that really invite new imaginaries and the capacity to question the heteronormative, patriarchal, white, elitist, European, disembodied imaginaries that have so deeply and profoundly shaped what knowledge we're capable of producing scientifically. So, yes.
Yeah, also, yes, I'll give you one reference and one story, if I may, right? So the reference is that in relation to the microbiome, really fascinating work being done by a South African anthropologist who now teaches in the UK, Thomas Cousins. And Thomas has been involved in studying responses to HIV/AIDS, and it completely breaks the sort of public health, global health paradigm, because what he does is he studies a nutritional intervention in a timber plantation in KwaZulu-Natal. And so what he's doing here is thinking about this question of HIV/AIDS not from a pharmaceuticalized public health intervention, but from a nutritional intervention. And he does so by thinking about it in relation to long histories of labor politics on the timber plantations, right? So it's deep. He hasn't published a book, but he has a number of articles, if you're interested, deeply, deeply interesting work. But then one of the things that he becomes interested in is that what that opens up then is what he calls an anthropology of the gut. Because nutrition now becomes not, a sort of mid-20th century paradigm of nutrition, which is developmentalist, but it becomes a deeply epigenetic question. And so the whole question of the microbiology of the gut as it gets implicated with nutritional interventions within long histories of labor on timber plantations, it's terrific work. That's the reference, right? In terms of this question of, yes. One of the reasons why I was so interested and invested in coming here was precisely to open up, ask myself the question of what do other modalities of intellectual, epistemic, sensory, and bodily engagement with these worlds afford us. And one of the limits of the history of anthropology as a practice is that it's largely been influenced by the ideology of the sort of solitary romantic field worker. But as Louisa said, to understand these problems, we need collaborations, right? There's just no way, and we need collaborations in deeply, radically interdisciplinary ways. And so the story is one of my emergent collaborations. Neither of us know what form this will take because we're both intrigued with each other but haven't figured each other out yet, is with a South African poet and playwright. And this is of great interest to me because in India, there's a long vernacular tradition of theater as a means of labor organizing, right? And as a means of sort of pedagogically showing the violences of capitalism. Not so much English theater, but in vernacular languages, it's very important. And so I met this poet and playwright, Stacey Hardy, who is a white woman who contracted tuberculosis and was never diagnosed because doctors in South Africa assumed that TB is a black disease. And so when she was finally diagnosed, the first question she got is, so what work do you do that takes you to the townships? And so she's written a play about this. But she didn't want to write a play about the sort of single white woman who's getting TB, when of course it is such a racialized disease. And so she's been going back to the colonial archives and trying to figure out the colonial history of TB in Southern Africa, which of course was a part of the world that didn't have TB until the Europeans in the 19th century, when there was a TB plague here, decided that Southern Africa would be their sanatorium. And so there were all of these people, according to her, many Germans in fact, who went to Southern Africa, didn't necessarily survive their TB, but managed to spread the disease there. And so that's how TB came to. And so there are all of these colonial archives and ruins in places like Port Elizabeth, which was the frontier of colonialism there. And so she's been trying to reconstruct this intertwining of her personal autobiography and the colonial history of TB in the form of a play, which is itself in collaboration with a South African musician, Neo Myanga, an extraordinary musician, and it's a play called The Museum of Lungs. And she performs that periodically in Europe. So if you can go, Munich, second week of November, Museum of Lungs, it's an extraordinary it's an extraordinary trajectory. And so this question of what it would mean to collaborate with practitioners like that is something that I'm very interested in exploring from a position of deep ignorance about these practices.
So we have time for one last question or remark. Is there? Yeah.
Hi. I have to think about all the interesting points you mentioned. But personally, I wonder, do you think that, as I assume there was a time when medication grew, when the availability in Western countries for medication grew, do you think it changed the way that we get sick and that we feel our health? And maybe are we attaching to viruses differently since we can buy everything in the market or something?
You know, a very quick answer to that, because it's a great question. I would refer you to the work of the historian of biology, Hannah Landecker, who's studying a history of signaling. And one of the things that Landecker is very keen on doing is that she's making an argument that instead of or in addition to understanding a history of biology, we really need a biology of history. And she has a number of entry points into that, but she has this wonderful article on antibiotic resistance, which speaks directly to this, right? Because what one is seeing now is forms of pharmaceutically mediated transspeciation, where both the ways in which our bodies depend on drugs and the ways in which bacteria and viruses live with and beyond drugs is being radically reshaped together through the antibiotic in ways that, again, has huge geopolitical differentiations, right? So the answer is yes, but work like that is really interesting in sort of helping us figure out how.
There was an important moment as well in the sort of 90s when the idea of disease mongering was quite widespread, and this idea that sort of, you know, the appearance of all these new drugs on the market, there was these substances and they had these effects that were sort of identified in clinical trials and that then sort of produced disease categories, which either sort of were more amorphous before the appearance of the drug, or then the drug helped redefine the symptoms. And so there's a way in which there's this kind of codependent co-production of, you know, and redefinition and sort of, you know, in the history of mental health, suddenly sort of, you know, melancholia becomes depression, which becomes serotonin deficiency, and that is intimately tied to the fact that we have, you know, SSRIs. So there's, you know, absolutely, I think you're pointing to something important in that sort of relationship between the availability of a treatment, the need to grow a market for that treatment, and the sudden, emergence. And we've seen as the DSM expands, new diseases are constantly appearing in relation to the appearance of new markets for new side effects of existing drugs that need to get recycled. So there's a tight coupling there for sure.
All right, thank you so much, Emilia and Kaushik, for this wonderful panel. It's been a real pleasure, and also thank you for your questions and comments. And we'll continue at 6 p.m. with Gabriele Grammelsberger. See you then.